And thanks to the organizers, to the National Lawyers Guild here at the university, and David Higgins, and everybody that helped put this together. I know I've been in touch with people here for a couple of years, and so here we are. And it's a real pleasure. Before I start, can I see a show of hands? How many people here are from Palestine or Israel or whatever you might want to call it? Cool. Anybody here, has anybody been there to visit? Can I see a show of hands? How many people have been there? Cool. I always like to ask, is there anybody who can't find it on a map? And, you know, it's a very small place, and usually the name of the country, regardless of what map you're looking at, whether it says Israel or Palestine, covers Cyprus, because it doesn't fit. And there was you may have heard, there was a funny incident at Rashida Tlaib's, the new congresswoman, office on the day of her swearing in. I was there, and a lot of people were there. And I don't know if you know Amr Zahar, the comedian. So he took a little sticky note. She has a big map of the world in the foyer of her office. And he took a little sticky note. He wrote Palestine with an arrow, and he stuck it on Egypt. Later on, somebody wrote, I saw a few days after that she erased Israel off the map. And she had nothing to do with it. She didn't even know that this was taking place. She was busy. But this was a little thing that Amr did. And he didn't erase it. He said, we're not erasing anything. We're just adding. So it's very easy to miss it if you don't really know how to look for it, because it is a very small place. Like you heard, my story, as the title of my first book, The General Son, suggests, I come from probably as strong and as patriotic and as Zionist a family as you could possibly have. My father was a general. I have a president. I have a signer of the Declaration of Independence. I have cabinet ministers, and on and on and on in my family. And so growing up, you know, Rabin, Weitzman, Katznelson, all these names, all these personas, if you know a little bit about Zionist history and the history of the State of Israel, these were like names we talked about, people we met, you know, on a daily basis almost. So that's where I come from. And that's the first part of the book, The General Son, is all about that, growing up. And it makes it, I've heard from many Palestinian friends that reading that part of the book is very difficult, because I describe it the way I felt it. I describe it the way I knew it, which is heroic and romantic and patriotic. And that's how I grew up, and that's what I knew. And then, like you heard, I went through a transformation. And usually major transformations occur as a result of a tragedy. That seems to be the case, usually. And in my case, it was the same thing. And when my niece, my sister's little girl, was killed, like you heard, in a suicide mission in Jerusalem, that was the tragedy that pushed me to go on this journey. And that's the journey of an Israeli in Palestine. That's kind of the second part of the book, really. And that journey is, you know, it started almost 20 years ago, and it's still going on, really. It's not a journey that ever ends, but it's not, you know, like I said, the country is very small. So any journey within that country is not going to be a very long journey, because it's not, no place is very far from any other place. But it's an enormous journey, psychologically, politically, emotionally, because really it's the journey from the sphere of the privileged to the sphere of the oppressed. And whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in the United States, whether it's any other country that was developed as a result of settler colonialism, you know, you live in the privileged, in the sphere of the privileged. You have plenty of water, you're safe, the roads are paved. Life is, you know, kind of like here, I suppose. And when you look over to the other side, if you ever do, and maybe that's what makes Palestine unique, because it's so small, you can pretty much see the other side. You often wonder, why are they so, you know, how come there's so many potholes, and why is it so dusty? And why does it look so different? Why are they not as, well developed as we are? And one of the things you often hear from people who visit the country is, look at what the Jews did, and look how they made the desert bloom, and look how wonderful the Jewish side, the Israeli side is, and look at the Palestinian side. Potholes and trash everywhere, and it's just dusty and nothing grows. It just seems poor. There must be something wrong with them. And obviously there must be some superiority that the Jews brought to Palestine, and that's why the Israeli side looks like this. And maybe that's a fair assessment, unless you take the journey. Because once you take the journey and you go into that other sphere, you learn things that otherwise there's no way to know. When you drive, if you've been to Palestine, if you've driven along the main roads, and when I say Palestine, I mean the entire country. I don't mean Ramallah and Bethlehem and Tulkarem. I mean the entire country. When you drive up the main roads, quite often you'll see Israeli colonies really across the highway from Palestinian towns. And if you pay close attention, you'll see that the Palestinian towns, the homes always have these big water tanks on their roofs. And when you look at the Israeli colonies, who are built on the land of these Palestinian towns, mostly, you never see these black water tanks. And unless you pay attention, it doesn't really mean anything. And what we don't know, and this gets, it varies from town to town, from locality to locality, but basically, it's a question of water distribution. Israel has a water authority called Mekorot, and they control all of the water distribution, all of it. Well, Palestinians are allocated throughout the entire country. Palestinians are allocated 3% of the water. Now, Palestinians today make up more than half of the population. Out of 12 million people who live in all of Palestine, Palestinians are probably close to 7 million. But they only get 3% of the water. So if you're in Abi Saleh, for example, I have friends who live there and I go there a lot, they get something like 12 hours of running water per week. The settlement across the street, literally across the street, has unlimited amounts of water. Unlimited. So of course their grass is green, and they have swimming pools, and everything looks great. And if you look at Abi Saleh, it's kind of dusty. And if you have a family and you know that all you're going to get is 12 hours of running water per week, then you have different calculations to make. And unless you know that particular detail, and it's not set in any law, it's just the way it is, unless you understand how impactful that is, then you can look at the Palestinian side and say, why are they so dirty? Why can't they grow anything? And that's the power of the journey. And that's why so few people take that journey. Because when you get into that, when you realize that is the reality, when you realize the horror the Palestinians have to live through and had to live through and have been living through since the State of Israel was established, and because the State of Israel was established, you can have no appreciation whatsoever to what is happening in that country, and what the people call it a conflict. I don't think it's a conflict. It's something different than a conflict. It's settler colonialism, it's racism, and so forth. There's no way to appreciate the depth of the horror. And as an Israeli coming from a family where half my life I was so proud to be part of this, family of pioneers and so on, it's a very difficult transition to make, and it's a very difficult reality to come to terms with. So that's, basically, in short, that's basically the story. And then as a result of this journey, I've reached the political conclusions that I have reached. Now, I like to make it really clear that for people who care about Israel, for people who love Israel, believe in Israel, the things that I have to say are extremely difficult, enraging, frightening. So at the end of the lecture today, if anybody in the audience feels that way about Israel, just be warned. This is going to be very difficult to hear, because my presentation is absolutely, decidedly one-sided, absolutely unbalanced, because there is no balance. There is no balance. When you have an enormous military power controlling a nation that's never had a military, there's no balance. And that's precisely what I'm going to be talking about today. But what I'd like to do, actually, is talk to you about my second book first. And the reason I want to talk to you about my second book first is because the story that I tell in the second book, in Injustice, is, in a way, a microcosm of the larger picture. It's a story that takes place here in the United States. It's a story that takes place, the heroes of the story, if you will, are Palestinian Americans. They've long been gone from their homeland. They had no expectation of ever returning. They made a life and a home and a family and a community here in America. And yet, they were still persecuted because they were Palestinians. And that's another part of the story that I think people don't have enough of an appreciation for. Why is it and how is it that even Palestinians who have already left, they were forced to leave, but are gone, they have a life and a family and a future here, are still being persecuted, as these 5 men were. So I'm going to briefly tell you the story and then tie it back in to the larger issue of Palestine. And the story of the Holy Land Foundation is a story of a very rapid success and then an incredibly tragic fall. And the success had to do with goodwill and the character and the hard work and the dedication of very, very good men. And the fall has everything to do with the fact that they're Palestinian Muslims living in America. Now, the Holy Land Foundation was, at its height, the largest Muslim charity organization in America. And everywhere I go around the country, I meet people who say, oh yes, at Ramadan, we always donated, we always gave money through the Holy Land Foundation. That's where we gave our charity. And a lot of young people, college kids, would tell me how they used to volunteer and so forth. And then in the early to mid-1990s, some of the watchdog, Zionist watchdog groups, these groups that are out there always sniffing around to make sure that the narrative, the Zionist narrative that always makes sure Israel is right and the Arabs are wrong, suddenly began to worry. Because the Holy Land Foundation, because of their great work, both in the US and overseas, I mean, they were there after 9/11, they were there after the Oklahoma City bombing, they were there after floods and earthquakes and all, both man-made and natural disasters here and around the world. They began to develop a very good reputation, a stellar reputation, and began alliances with other relief organizations, international ones and local ones and so forth. So the Anti-Defamation League, which you may have heard of, the ADL, which pretends to be a kind of a civil rights organization, but really is a racist organization that supports violence and terrorism against Palestinians and perpetuates lies against Palestinians and Muslims in America, they began to poison public opinion about the Holy Land Foundation. And they had people like Chuck Schumer and Anthony Weiner and all these young Jewish, at the time, young Jewish politicians, Zionist politicians, who were helping them with this. So they went to the IRS, they went to other organizations that were working, collaborating with Holy Land Foundation, and they started saying that the money they're sending to Palestine is actually going to terrorism. That they're all members of Hamas, and that all their money is actually going to Hamas. That prompted the FBI to start looking at them. That prompted all kinds of problems for them, newspaper articles, and they were located, their headquarters was in Dallas, Texas. The Dallas Morning News, I think, is the local paper, started publishing articles about them and how they're all members of Hamas and so on and so forth. Until the mid-1990s, that really wasn't an issue, but from the mid-1990s, Hamas became a designated terrorist organization. And so from that moment on, it became illegal to do business with Hamas. And so, but they survived, they worked with the system, they did whatever they could, and then 9/11 took place. And by December of that year, so 3 months after 9/11, the President of the United States had to make a statement to show that something was being done. And there are several books, and I talk about this in the book as well. There was this atmosphere in Washington. We need to find somebody. We need to punish somebody. We need to freeze assets. We need to take money away. We need to show that there's some terrorist network that we were able to stop. And the atmosphere was, let's round up the usual suspects. And they were at the top of the list. They were Muslims. They were Palestinians. They were devout Muslims. In other words, it was a religious organization. And they were sending money to Palestine. They're the perfect target. So George Bush, on December the 4th, 2001, announced that they were being closed down and designated them a terrorist organization. Now, several interesting things happened from that moment on. The first one is that they were not concerned. And I know this because I spoke to their lawyers. So the people that were running the organization said, well, America's panicking. Obviously, America's afraid. Obviously, we're Muslims. You know, the attacks were done by Muslims. It'll be fine. This is America. We did nothing wrong. We can prove it. We have every dime. We can trace every dime, where it came from, where it went, and so on. So they weren't worried. Their lawyers sued the government, which is what you do when the government acts arbitrarily. They brought in all the evidence to show that every penny that they had, exactly where it came from, where it went. Nothing went to terrorism, nothing went to any political or military organization. And the government had its own file, which is called the administrative folder, where the government shows and tries to explain why they did what they did. Why did they close them down and freeze their assets? There were no sworn statements, nothing under oath. Nothing was notarized, a few newspaper articles, really nothing very impressive at all. And the Holy Land Foundation had a body of evidence that was absolutely clear. They did everything right. And they went to court. But there was one problem. The government had a piece of paper that was sent over by the government of Israel that said, according to which, one of their employees in Jerusalem admitted, while he was being interrogated by the Israelis, that some of the money actually went to Hamas. Well, that's a problem. So the lawyers contacted his lawyer, because he was arrested by the Israelis, who was a very well-known human rights lawyer in Jerusalem, and asked her about it. And she said, what are you talking about? I have all of his statements. He said, no such thing. So she sent his statement over. They had it translated, notarized, under oath, and it turned out that he said the opposite. He said, we never gave according to political or military affiliations. We only gave based on need. The government had the wrong translation. When they came to court, the judge decided to dismiss the case and struck all the evidence from the record. So all the body of evidence that supported the Holy Land Foundation's case was thrown out. The right translation was struck out. The wrong translation remained in the government's folder. Then they went to appeal, and the appellate court said something that made the lawyers realize that something was very wrong and their clients were never going to get a fair trial in America. The appellate court said, yes, the judge should not have struck the evidence, should not have dismissed the case, but this is not a normal case. This is a case of national security. And when the lawyers understood that this is now being treated, they're not being treated as just citizens, they're being treated as terrorists. In other words, they are guilty until proven innocent. They realized there's going to be a big problem. And then over time, the lawyers heard that there's a criminal case opened against them. And they thought, what could be, there's no crime. How could they open a criminal case? So what the government did is it changed the story a little bit. Instead of saying that they gave money to Hamas, they said this: Hoyland Foundation was working with these local charity organizations in Palestine, which, by the way, the State Department was working with, and USAID was working with, and the United Nations was working with, and so on and so forth, because these are the organizations on the ground that are reliable. And they said those organizations are controlled by Hamas, and therefore the money that they gave to these organizations was supporting Hamas. And they brought evidence from Israel. They brought 2 anonymous witnesses, expert witnesses from Israel, members of the Israeli secret police, and so on, military intelligence, who testified anonymously, the first time in the history of the United States that this was permitted in a court of law, that expert witnesses were allowed to give evidence in a court of law like this. And still, they couldn't make a case. They just couldn't make the case. The story they said was this. Hoyland Foundation had a program where they were supporting orphans. Well, they said, when they're supporting orphans, they're not just supporting terrorism, they're encouraging terrorism. Because why are these Palestinian children orphans? Their fathers must have been terrorists. So the defense team took the list of orphans and checked the cause of death of the fathers. And they had nothing to do, their deaths had nothing to do with anything that could be related to terrorism. When I heard this, I went the other way and I checked the list of some 200 or so Palestinians who participated in suicide missions. None of them had children. So whichever way you look at it, those orphans did not become orphans because of anything that had to do with terrorism. Yet in a court of law, they had terrorism experts, PhDs that sit in think tanks in Washington, D.C., testify under oath that by supporting Palestinian orphans, they were encouraging terrorism. And that is how the case was built. Well, they finished the first trial, and it was a mistrial. They couldn't get any convictions. In fact, one of them, and I'll show you who they are in a second. One of the defendants was found not guilty on all charges. So there was a mistrial, and the judge declared a second trial. And at the end of the second trial, or throughout the second trial, the new judge allowed evidence that even the first judge did not allow. And I did an interview with Rolf Nader, and he said, he read the book, and he said, well, it sounds like the second judge was what we call a hanging judge. In other words, they're going to hang, no matter what. And that's exactly what happened. And then they went to appeal, because they were all convicted, and the defense team said, look, the appellate court said, yes, perhaps the second judge should not have allowed some of these pieces of evidence, but it was harmless. So the lawyer said, but how could it be harmless? The first trial ended with no convictions, the second trial ended with all convictions, and the difference were these pieces of evidence that should not have been allowed to begin with. But the appellate court didn't care. That was the end of the story. The Supreme Court wouldn't hear it, and President Obama was petitioned to commute their sentences and wouldn't even look at it. So today, I'm going to show you them. Let me show them one at a time because I think it's worth seeing them. So this is the elder of the group. There are 5 of them. The Hoyland Foundation 5. They're called the HLF 5. This is Muhammad al-Mazain. He was like the imam. He was kind of like the spiritual guide behind this whole thing. And this is in prison. I met him in federal prison. He received 15 years in federal prison. He lived in San Diego for many, many years. He lived in Patterson. He was an imam. He was a highly learned man. Very, very impressive, very, very impressive man. And you sit with this older gentleman who was clearly innocent in a prison visitation room, which is a horrible experience. And you can see he walks with a cane. And the guards at one point do a count. And this guard, who could be his grandson, just kind of goes, you. You know, it's heart-wrenching. It's terrible to see. And this is Abdurrahman Ode. Abdurrahman Ode has an interesting story. He had nothing to do with the organization. But he was a volunteer. He donated some money. He would go on missions, but he didn't have anything to do with the actual organizations. He had a soup kitchen in Patterson, New Jersey. And then for several years, the FBI kept coming to him and asking him to work with the FBI. And he kept saying, no, no, no. They caught him when he went overseas on missions on the way back. They stopped at his office countless times. And he said, absolutely not. Then finally, after many attempts, the FBI agent who kept coming said, you know what, you're going to pay for this. And then when the trial, the criminal case began, he heard that his name was included in the indictment. And during the trial, they came to him and they wanted to offer him a deal where if he would plea and work with the government, he could be out in 3 years. 3 years for terrorism charges is a great deal. But it came with a gag order. In other words, he couldn't talk about the case. So he says, I'm going to get out. I will not be able to say anything, and you're going to use my plea to hurt my friends. Thank you very much. I pass. Then they came back to him later, and they offered him 6 months. And all the other guys said to him, take the deal. 6 months, you'll be out. He said, I'm not going to do it with a gag order. I'm not going to save myself in order to, and then hurt my friends. He's now serving 15 years in federal prison. And when I met him, we're sitting in this visitation room. I met him several times. He said to me, alhamdulillah, thank God, I sleep well at night. I have no problem. 15 years in federal prison, when you're, past middle age, it's a lot of time. You have kids and family and so forth. You don't meet people like that every day. Mufid Abdul Qadir had also nothing to do with the organization, and he was found not guilty on all charges after the first trial. There were 32 charges in the indictment. He was found not guilty. The judge called out, not guilty 32 times. And then when the prosecution decided to poll the jury, one of the jurors stood up and she said, no, I made a mistake. That's not what I meant. So the foreman and the defense team all stood up and said, what do you mean? You signed it. It's a done deal. The judge immediately called the mistrial, and he's serving 20 years in federal prison now. So not only was he innocent, but he was actually found not guilty. But he has a brother, and the name of his brother is Khalid Mossad. And Khalid Mossad was the head of the political bureau of Hamas for many, many years. And he was the Hamas connection. And when the prosecution made their opening statement, the prosecutor made his opening statement, he said, we can't convict based on family connections. Family connections are not a reason to convict. And then they brought expert witnesses to say that in terrorism cases, family connections are extremely important. So that's Mufid Abdul Qadir. And this is Ghassan Elashi. He is one of the two people that got 65 years. He was like the president of the organization. For reasons that were never explained to me, I was not able to visit him. He's originally from Gaza. A wonderful man, incredible story. And I tell each one of their stories in the book. And finally, Shukri Abubakr, who also got 65 years, and he was a CEO. He was really the engine that ran the organization. And again, in the opening statement, the prosecutor said, well, Hoyland Foundation was established in 1987. Hamas was established in 1987. There you have it. Obviously, there's a connection. What he left out was the first Palestinian Intifada, the uprising, began in 1987, and there was an enormous need for relief because of closures, because people couldn't work, couldn't buy food, and so on and so forth. Another thing that happened in 1987 was Shukri's daughter Sandra was born, and she was born with several life-threatening diseases and had to use the help of charity and charity hospitals and so forth. And he was exposed to this whole world of relief organizations and charity, medical help and so forth. And that's what prompted him to get into this field. And she really was his inspiration, and I dedicate the book to her, to Sanabil. So here we have 5 good men, not just good men. These are the 5 best people you will ever meet. Let's be absolutely clear. Not just that they're innocent. They're absolutely the 5 best men you will ever meet. And they're sitting in federal prison, 2 of them for 65 years, innocent, only because they're Palestinians, only because they're Muslims, and only because of this very strange relationship between the United States and Israel. And these pro-Israeli Zionist watchdog groups that move around here and try to make sure that the narrative, the Holy Grail, according to which Israel is right, Palestinians are wrong, no matter what. That's why these men are in prison. So let's talk about Palestine a little bit and kind of the bigger picture again, kind of zoom out again. So until the 14th of May 1948, this country was called Palestine. If you look at period maps going back as far as, I don't know, when you look at that area, it says Palestine. If you go to Monticello in Virginia, to Thomas Jefferson's house, his father was a cartographer, there's a huge map of Africa in the foyer. And if you look up and kind of east from there, there's a long stretch of land. And it says Palestine over it. It was Palestine. And then, from a certain moment on, it became Israel. And from the end of really 1947 throughout all of 1948 and going on till today, Palestine has been consistently and systematically erased off the map. Now, I'm going to use three words here that for many people are going to sound very harsh, but I stand behind these words. From the end of 1947, when the United Nations decided to partition Palestine and create two states, kind of the beginning, one of the real official two-state solution, actually, if you will, Israel began a massive campaign to get rid of the Palestinians. A massive campaign of ethnic cleansing that was planned, that was well executed, that was planned for years before that, because they didn't just go into town after town, village after village, randomly. They had maps of every town. They had maps of every village. They knew exactly the escape routes. They knew where the mosque was, where the school was, where the well was. The Israeli forces came in, the Zionist forces came in, they knew exactly what they were doing. And it was a campaign of ethnic cleansing that began immediately at the end of 1947 and goes on till today, actually. Throughout 1948, it was massively executed. Close to 1 million Palestinians were kicked out. Hundreds of towns and villages were wiped off the face of the earth. But it's a campaign of ethnic cleansing without any doubt. And the objective was to get rid of the Palestinians so that eventually we could create a Jewish majority, because if you're going to have a Jewish state, you need to have a Jewish majority. The second word I use, which creates some people find harsh, is genocide. If you look at the definition of the crime of genocide, according to the Geneva Convention, and you compare that to what Israel has been doing for the last 7 decades, it fits to a word. Maybe one or two of the items are not exactly the same, but it fits to a word. The destruction of another people, a culture, a history, changing of the names, which the most obvious is suddenly the country was called Israel. Name of cities, name of towns, names of streets, all changed and continue to change to this very day. Not to mention massacre after massacre after massacre. Way before the massacres that we've seen in Gaza from starting in 2008, these big, massive ones where they kill thousands of people in a matter of a couple of weeks, several weeks. And in the definition of genocide, there has to be intent. You have to show that there's intent. If you drop a bomb and kill 100 innocent people by mistake, that's not genocide. If you do it consistently, systematically, for 7 decades, I think the intent is pretty clear. And it's an ongoing genocide that began then and goes on to this very day without any sense of anybody trying to stop it. And then, to maintain the country as a Jewish state, mind you, they took an Arab country and tried to turn it into a Jewish state. They imposed an apartheid regime, excuse me. They imposed an apartheid regime from the very inception of the Jewish state, from the very inception of the state of Israel. The very first laws, the very definition of the state of Israel defines it as an apartheid, where you have different parts of the population living under different sets of laws. Some have kind of a quasi citizenship. Some have a different kind of a citizenship. Some have no citizenship. Some live in area this, some live in area that. And the rules change all the time, and the laws keep adding on and on and on and on and on. And this was done really in two stages. The first stage was 1948, then when 80% of the country was taken. Then 1967, they finished the job, and they took what was left behind. These two little areas that Israel created, by the way, that have no real significance besides the fact that somebody sat and drew them on a map, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They have no natural boundaries. There's no reason for them to be separate from the rest of the country, but those are the boundaries that Israel wanted at the beginning of 1949. Then they decided it was time to take it all, which was the intention to begin with, and they did. And we have a Palestinian in the audience from Amwas, which is one of the oldest historic towns in Palestine. And immediately after 1967, the Israeli forces came with bulldozers and leveled it. And an Israeli photographer just randomly happened to be walking around and take pictures, and he went to the commander and he said, "Why are you destroying this town?" They said, "Oh, we're settling accounts from 1948, because in 1948 there was some very heavy fighting and very strong resistance from the Palestinians in that area." So in 1967, it's estimated that about 500,000 Palestinians were thrown out. So the ethnic cleansing goes on, and it goes on in many different ways. It's not just putting people on buses and forcing them out, but it's also through laws. It's also making through life impossible, through denial of water, and on and on and on. Probably one of the most violating aspects of the apartheid and the ethnic cleansing is the way Israel treats Palestinian children. And I'm going to talk about probably the most famous of all the cases, the case of Ahad Tamimi. Has anybody heard of Ahad Tamimi? Almost everybody. And the reason I talk about Ahad is not because she became very well known, but it's because her father is one of my best friends, just happens to be one of my best friends. And I've known her and I've known her family for many, many, many years. And so I know for me, it was also personal. And I just threw a few pictures together just to kind of demonstrate her story. So this is her and her father and I, just the front yard of their house. This is her during a protest. And in fact, one of the accusations against her was that she was disrupting throughout her, not just the case where she actually arrested, but throughout her activism, she was disrupting the work of soldiers and officers. And at one point in Abi Saleh, about a year before this happened, I was there to protest, and I was being arrested, and she grabbed me and pulled me away, so that the soldiers wouldn't be able to take me. And there was this tug of war going on. Anyway, so for me, this case was personal. Then there's a picture of her in handcuffs in the court. And then eventually, she was freed after, I believe, 8 or 9 months in prison. Now, because her case was such a high-profile case, and there was so much international support, she probably didn't suffer all of the types of torture and humiliation and abuse that Palestinian children suffer, who are not so well known. So thankfully, the international community really stood up to support her and and really to support Palestinian children, but she became the symbol. But what Palestinian children go through when they're being detained, when they're being held, when they're being interrogated, are things that we can't even begin to imagine because we don't live in that kind of an environment. Being dragged out of the house at 2 o'clock in the morning without a parent, without a lawyer, in a Jeep with a bunch of soldiers, thrown in a cell, interrogators, no lawyer, no parents, threats, intimidation, exposure to the elements, exposure to cold or hot weather, denying, going to the bathroom, denying, on and on and on, things that we wouldn't even dream. And this goes on with kids all the time, every day. There's a town near Jerusalem called Silwan. I'll just tell you this quick story. And it's part of Jerusalem, so they get arrested by the Israeli special unit of the Israeli police. And they're taken to this place called the Maskubia in Arabic. It's a Russian compound. There used to be a big Russian church. There still is a Russian church there. and Israeli police headquarters and interrogation offices of the secret police are there under the ground. And there's a cell there called cell number 4. And all the kids know about cell number 4. Why? Because you come out on all fours from the beating and the torture. And every kid in Silwan has been to cell number 4, and other places too. Again, like I said, thankfully I probably didn't go through, because of the exposure, she was spared some of the, but you know, why was she held before the trial? Why was she not released until the trial? You know, the judge said that she was dangerous, that her attitude was dangerous, you know, things like that. Now, I don't know if help is on the way, but I think we stand a fighting chance now with this new Congress. And in the previous Congress, there was a bill that was brought up, has a very long name, Promoting Human Rights by Ending Israeli Military Detention of Palestinian Children Act. In the previous Congress, it was called 4391. It became quite famous. And this is a bill that was introduced by Betty McCollum from Minnesota. Pretty brave woman. Very brave woman. And she was barely able to get 30 co-sponsors. Now, here's some data that is included in the bill. And this is stuff that people who are active, people who are in the, you know, work with this issue know well. Israel arrests somewhere between 500 and 700 Palestinian children each year. By the way, after Trump declared that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, that number tripled. It tripled because it empowered the Israelis, it empowered the police, it empowered the soldiers. 99% conviction rate. Now, there are no juvenile facilities. They're held and tried as security prisoners. And what the bill does, which is probably one of the reasons so many members of Congress are afraid to touch it, and what I heard something very disturbing when I was at the Capitol last week, is none of the Jewish members of Congress want to touch it, want to support it. And why they wouldn't is beyond me, but that seems to be the reality. Torture, physical violence. I mean, you can look at death threats, solitary confinement. And the purpose of these is twofold. One is to get confessions, because they don't get to see a lawyer until they confess. So one is to get confessions. The other one is to have them point fingers. So I have friends, adult friends, who are sent to jail as a result of testimony under these conditions by minors who pointed to them or named their name. So hopefully, you know, it seems that this bill will be reintroduced in this Congress, but unless every single member of Congress understands that we as constituents demand that they support this bill, nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen. So there are 30 already. Everybody's got to find out who their representative is and start sending letters and phone calls and visiting their office and saying, we demand that you support this bill. And all it says is really that U.S. aid money can't go to doing this. It doesn't say Israel's got to stop it. It says that U.S. aid money shouldn't go to supporting the detention and torture of children. That's all. That's all the bill says. And even with that, you can barely get more than 30 members of Congress to support it. But like I said, there seems to be some winds of change in the Capitol right now, so I would encourage everybody to do absolutely everything they can to get their representatives to support this bill, because it's a start. And it's also historic because it's the first time Palestinian rights are introduced as a bill, as an issue, without some condition that they have to meet, because it's about children. And who in the House of Representatives thinks that American money should go to torturing children? Let's see a show of hands. I mean, I think that's how we need to present it. Now I'm going to take you to a place that's rarely spoken of. It's called the Nakab Desert. It's about 50%, almost 50% of all of Palestine, the southern part of Palestine. And in it's a desert, but it's a very fertile desert. So immediately after 1948, 49, when Israel was established and captured most of Palestine, they began a massive campaign of kicking out the indigenous Palestinian Bedouins and developing towns and settlements and colonies and so forth. Today, there are over 100,000 Palestinian Bedouins who are citizens of Israel, because the residents of the Nakab are citizens of Israel, who live in towns that refuse to move, refuse to be relocated. So they get no services, they get no water, they get no electricity, they get no health care, they get no roads, they get no access to emergency care. They have to go and buy water at inflated prices. They're not allowed to cultivate their land. And all of this happens as Israeli Jewish colonies are being built all over the place and thriving. And then there's another population who were relocated. They're called internally displaced, who are also living in horrifying conditions. Second, third, fourth class citizens. They're all citizens, by the way. No access to anything that I, who grew up as an Israeli citizen, had. And again, unless somebody like me ventures out of the sphere of the privileged into that sphere, there's no way of knowing this is going on. And the Nakab is almost 50% of the country. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of citizens of the state of Israel. Citizens. So it's not just about the laws that discriminate against the Palestinians, it's also about the reality in which they live. Al-Araqib was one of these villages, became very famous because they were destroyed 135 times and kept coming back. Now they just arrested. I was there in November with a delegation from the British Labour Party, and we met the Sheikh Sayag of the village, and he was waiting for an appeal because he was tried by the Israeli courts because of his resistance, because of unwillingness to be kicked out, and kept coming back. And he just got a 10-month prison sentence. So the appeal was denied shortly after we saw him, and now he's in jail. And that's me and this other group. So what do we do? I mean, what do we do? What do we do? Resistance is the only answer. When there's oppression, when there's settler colonialism, when there's violence, resistance is the only answer. Resistance is what we need to do. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the different forms of resistance that there are, but I'm going to talk about one particular form of resistance which is extremely effective, morally the right thing to do, has a track record, and anybody can participate at any level. And these three letters, BDS, have become the three most frightening letters to anybody in the Israeli government and in the Zionist establishment. If they could take those three letters out of every word, I think they could. They would. They are so scared of these three letters, and they are putting everything they have to fight this. And one of the claims is that it's anti-Semitic. Chuck Schumer says that it's a new form of anti-Semitism. I don't know if you heard him speak about it. But has anybody ever taken the trouble to take a look at what the demands of the BDS call? The BDS call came from Palestinians, from Palestinian civil society, from the largest coalition of Palestinian organizations ever to agree on anything. And they came up with this demand to impose boycott, divestment, and sanctions until three very, what I think are reasonable demands are met. And what are these demands? The right of the refugees to return. That's been enshrined in international law and UN resolutions, and it's been done before in other cases. Ending the military occupation in parts of Palestine where there's still a military occupation, what used to be the West Bank, Gaza, and equal rights for Palestinians. So they have the same rights as I do, same privileges that I do. So basically justice, freedom, and equality. Can somebody point out the anti-Semitism in this? Because I don't see it. Somebody want to tell me that freedom, justice, and equality contradict Jewish values? Because that would be anti-Semitic. To say that this is incongruent with Jewish values, that's anti-Semitic. These are the most reasonable, well thought out, demands you could possibly imagine from a nation that is struggling for its freedom. They're not talking about killing. They're not talking about deporting. They're not talking about kicking anybody out or displacing. They're talking about remedy. Remedy to the reality in which Palestinians live, which was created by Israel. A reality which was created by the establishment of Israel. That's what it's about. And as you can see here on the front, there's a very important campaign going on now against Elbit Systems. Elbit is the biggest conglomerate. They own all of the Israeli arms manufacturing companies now. And they do a great deal. Remember the Bob Dylan song, Masters of War? You couldn't have imagined a monster like this when he wrote that. If you don't know it, check it out, Masters of War. They manufacture some of the worst weapon systems we can imagine, targeting Palestinian civilians and then selling it as proven, as battle-proven, after they use it in Gaza on a civilian population that's never had a military force. But of course, there's Hamas, so Hamas is the devil, so it's okay to use these weapons against them. They do horrifying things, and they spend a lot of money. Oh, by the way, and they're being used now in the border with Mexico and here in Arizona. Their systems are being used. So that's something for Arizonians to do. And there's a long list. I'm just going to show it to you briefly. You can take a picture of it, or you can check it out later. Code Pink really did a great job on putting all this together, of members of Congress who received campaign contributions from this monster, from Elbit. And you can see Texas really, really likes them. They spend a lot of money in Texas. That's a lot of members. And I know there was a member, representative in Arizona that used to receive. I don't know what's going on with that now, but you need to get up and make sure that members of your representatives are not receiving Elbit money. So that's one campaign that could really make an enormous difference. And these are exactly the types of campaigns that if we all put our heads together, and because they're well targeted, they're well focused, and they work. There have been other campaigns like this that have worked very, very well. And again, I urge people to go online, go to bdsmovement.org, check out their campaigns, see how you can contribute, see what you can do. It starts by just not buying. Then it goes on to organizing. Then it goes on to making sure that our representatives and our senators know that we demand that they stand against this assault on our First Amendment rights and the assault against BDS. Because BDS, number one, is a First Amendment right, and number two, it's the morally right thing to do. And number three, Palestinians are dying. And if we sit on our backsides and do nothing, they will continue to die. There'll be no end in sight. You know, people ask me, so is there hope? Is there going to be change? Well, it depends on us. Change can come tomorrow or it can come never. Depends on what we do. And here's an opportunity. So the reality today is there's Israel, there's a single state called Israel on all of Palestine. It's a single state. The Israeli government governs the lives of every single person that lives there under different sets of laws. But they govern the lives, the amount of water, the ability to travel, the ability to work, the ability to go to school, how much you eat, everything. Under different sets of laws, under different realities. If you're in Jerusalem, it's one set of laws. If you're Palestinian. Not if you're like me, I'm from Jerusalem. I've been gone for 25 years. I can go back tomorrow, no problem. Palestinian from Jerusalem leaves after, I think it's 3 years. They change the laws all the time, so it's hard to keep track. They lose their ID. Now, they don't have citizenship. They only have an alien residence. Some of the Palestinian families in Jerusalem have been there since the days of Salah ad-Din, more than 1,000 years. They leave to go to school, to, I don't know, decide to live in America or somewhere for a few years. They're gone. They can't come back. Their ID is taken away, as their house and their property. Doesn't happen to me. I was born and raised in Jerusalem. I can go back tomorrow. So there's an apartheid regime that's continuously and systematically engaged in ethnic cleansing and genocide. That's Israel. Anybody who supports Israel, that's the deal. There's no other pie-in-the-sky, friendly, loving, new two-state solution, peaceful Israel. There's no such thing. Never was. Israel killed every opportunity to create partition in Palestine, from going back to 1947. Every opportunity, every time it came up, Israel did absolutely everything it could. And it's not a single government. It's consecutive governments. And it's not a dictatorship. It's the people who vote. Israelis vote in high numbers. For Israeli Jews, it's a democracy. Israeli society voted for these people, and they, in the name of their constituents, made sure that there would never be any partition, there would never be a two-state solution, there would never be a Palestinian state. So this is something that Israel has done. Created a single state for everyone, but we have to live under different laws, because it has to be a Jewish state. What's Jewish about it? I really don't know. Other than Jews get privileges. But that's the reality today. So is there hope? Again, it all depends on us. But we also need to define, what does hope look like? What is hope? What do we want to see? What is it that will, is the reality today hopeful? More racist laws? More violence, more bombing and killing of Palestinians. This new law you may have heard of, the nation-state law, which really has taken all the laws that were already there on the books and made them constitutional. So now, Israel doesn't have a constitution, but they have these special basic laws which are like a constitution. So now, you can't fight these in court, all these racist laws. And according to this law, only Jews, all Jews, but only Jews, have a right to self-determination in Palestine. Palestinians who have been living there, their families for 1,000 years, have no right to self-determination in Palestine. And on and on and on. And Palestine is crossed off the map. But there is another option. There is the option of freedom and justice and equality. There is the option to uncross Palestine and bring it back on the map. There is the option to create a real, free, democratic Palestine with equal rights. But we have to fight for it. We have to make sure that that's what we're doing. We have to stop feeling queasy about saying that Zionism is a racist ideology, that Israel is a racist state, that if we care about justice, if we care about human rights and human life, then we must support a single democracy with equal rights. A single democracy with equal rights. The right of return of the refugees, absolutely a right. Without any question. If somebody chooses not to return, that's their issue. But they have a right, then they should be allowed to and be given the opportunity to do so. So there are opportunities. None of these things are, all these things have been done before. God only knows, Jewish people know about restitution, right? Millions, billions were given from Germany to the state of Israel, by the way, not to the survivors of the Holocaust, but to the state of Israel, which is a whole other issue. So there is an opportunity. Now, I want to leave you with this picture talking about hope. The place in which these children live, I took this picture, is so horrifying that if you set foot there, after 5 minutes, you'd be in tears. And you'd want to run away. I promise you, the conditions under which these children live, it's a refugee camp just an hour from Palestine, an hour drive from Palestine, maybe 2 hours away from where their families originally came. None of us would be smiling and horsing around, I can promise you that. Because I went there with a group of friends, and within 5 minutes we were all in tears. And why do they have to live like this? No water, no plumbing, no heating, it's freezing cold in the winter, no access to health care, no access to jobs, no access to proper nutrition. And in this particular camp, they're not even registered as refugees. So they don't even get this little bit of aid the refugees do get from international organizations. Why? Who knows? Some bureaucracy. Thousands and thousands of children in this particular camp. Millions across and around Palestine. Only because Israel has banned them from returning. Only because Israel passed a law that says they cannot return. There's no reason for Palestinian children to live like this, to need aid, to need relief. Why do Palestinians need relief? Highly educated people, hardworking people. Look at Palestinian communities everywhere. Thriving. Only where Israel is controlling do they have to live in these conditions? And I want to invite you to really come to terms with what it means when we say free Palestine. It means a free Palestine, from the river to the Mediterranean Sea, from the Nakab to Al Jalil in the north, Jerusalem and Jaffa and Haifa, and every city and every town, every village, no checkpoints, no racist laws, a real democracy with equal rights. And if we do our job, I think we do have a fighting chance over the next few months or perhaps 1 year. I really, really urge everybody to get up and fight and do the right thing to make this happen, to see Palestine free. Thank you all very much.